lock the room, right?
No need of locking.
No, ma'am, I didn't lock it. Please check in the YouTube links. Yep.
Ma'am, we are live. You can start.
A very good morning to Dr. Swarlipi, all the faculty members, and our ITC cell. Greetings to all the participants from PG Department of English, Kasturba Gandhi Degree and PG College for Women. PG Department of English is hosting this webinar titled Global Pandemic, a Humanitarian Crisis in Need of Rediscovery and Rejuvenation. Our guest speaker for today is Dr. Swarlipi Nandi, and the session for today is going to be for an hour, after which the speaker will answer the queries of the participants. The participants can post the questions in the chat box, which will be forwarded to the speaker at the end of the session. Thank you. A very warm welcome to Dr. Swarlipi, HOD Department of English, Psychology and Journalism, Loyola Academy, UG and PG College, Hyderabad. A passionate teacher, a prolific writer, a wonderful friend and guide to her colleagues and the students. I greet you, Dr. Swarlipi, on behalf of the PG Department of English, Kasturba Gandhi Degree and PG College for Women. I also extend a very warm welcome to all our participants, and I hope that the next hour and a half is going to be a learning moment for all of us. This is the final session of this webinar. Thank you. And at the onset, I would like to throw some light on the topic. I begin with the quote from In Memories of W.B. Yeats. Follow poet, follow right, to the bottom of the night. By thy unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With a farming of a verse, make a vineyard of a curse. Sing of human unsuccess, in a rapture of distress. In the desert of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Literature gives us a deeper understanding of any situation. Literature preserves history. Literature preserves the anguish, fear, and anxiety which the people faced under social, economic, and political distress. The trauma of any national hazard or any natural calamity has best found its way into the books, stories, novels, and poetries of its time. Whether it was the exodus of the Jews from the land of Egypt or the movement of the Native Americans beyond the Mississippi River, whether it was the apartheid during the colonial rule in America or the Holocaust in Germany during the World War II, whether it was the partition of India or the plight of the Nepali women, or even the Jaffna crisis, the trail of tears have always been preserved in literature. In all this, man has paid a heavy price. As humanity was laid to rest, it took a toll on the very psyche of people. As Professor Nagaraju stated yesterday, it is time that individual who believes in the strength of pen should become a bard to the plight of people and a beacon of hope to this unusual time. History bears witness to the fact that crisis has produced some great literature. With the desire to understand the trauma which the people underwent, generations later have studied literature to be inspired by the strength it took to once again emerge from the harrowing experiences, a little banged up, a little cynical, a little mature, hoping and trusting ever, even though the fear lurks in the dark that history is bound to repeat itself. I now request Ms. Gayatri, Faculty, PG Department of English, to introduce Dr. Swarlipi, the guest speaker for the day.
Ma'am, am I visible?
No.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes, you're visible.
Okay. Audible. That's why literature is so fascinating. It's always up for the interpretation and could be 100 different things to 100 different people. It's never the same twice by Sarah. So, very good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the two-day national webinar on global pandemic, a humanitarian crisis, the need of rediscovery and rejuvenation. The topic for today is literary responses to the times of crisis, a survey of Indian texts. I, Ms. Gayatri, Faculty of PG Department of English, take immense pleasure in introducing our honorable guest speaker, Dr. Swarlipi Nandi. Some voice disturbance.
Sorry, ma'am. Except Gayatri ma'am, the others can mute their audio. Whoever is speaking, they will unmute their audio.
Shall I start again, ma'am?
Ma'am, continue.
Okay. Assistant Professor of English, Dr. Swarlipi Nandi holds the position of Head Department of English, Journalism and Psychology at Loyola Academy Degree and PG College, Secunderabad. She has attended the esteemed universities of HCU and JNU for her Masters and MPhil. She holds a PhD in English from Kent State University, USA. Her research focuses on post-colonial literature, neoliberal globalization, and environmental humanities. She is the recipient of the prestigious Richard Turnow Fellowship and Pringle Dissertation Fellowship. She is currently working in the field of energy humanities and is a member of Petroculture's International Research Group. She has 2 edited books to her credit. First one being The Post-National Fantasy, Essays on Post-Colonialism, Cosmopolitics, and Science Fiction. And the second one, Spectacles of Blood, a study of violence, masculinity in post-colonial films. Her forthcoming edited volume titled Oil Fictions, World Literature and Our Contemporary Petrospheres is in production with UPenn Press. Her works have appeared in the reputed international journals like Interventions, Journal of Narrative Theory, Studies in Travel Writing, Literary Geographies, and others. We are obliged to have Dr. Swarlipi Nandi here as a speaker of the day. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us for the event. All of us are impatient to hear your insights on literary responses to the times of crisis. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Swarlipi Nandi to take over from here. Ma'am, welcome, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Ms. Gayatri, for the kind introduction. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Before I begin, I would like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Anjali Malia, HOD, Department of English, and all the members of the Department of English, Kasturba Gandhi College, Degree and PG College, for inviting me to speak to you. And my warm greetings to all the participants today who are here. My topic today is literature in the times of crisis, and I will be talking about selected Indian literary texts that represent different points of calamity and disasters in the Indian history. Before I begin, let me share my PPT with you. Please let me know if it is visible. And I will be turning off my video while the presentation is on so that the whole screen can be taken up by the PPT. Once it is over, I will turn on my video and we can have an interactive session. Is that fine?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Your slideshow.
Please let me know if the slideshow has begun. I have just given it for slideshow.
Yeah, and yes, ma'am. It has
Yes.
started.
Okay, I may start then. Okay. So the topic today is literature during the times of crisis. Now, before we go on to talk about texts, let me ponder over some basic questions. And these questions have already been raised by Dr. Anjali in her introduction about the role of literature in terms of addressing the realities of a pandemic. How do we see literature doing its job? So before we talk about that, let us also talk about what is humanitarian crisis. Now, a humanitarian crisis can be defined as a singular event or a series of events that are threatening in terms of health, safety, or well-being of a community or a large group of people. The contemporary pandemic is definitely a humanitarian crisis that has affected people on a global scale. As we battle through the disaster, as people who are connected to literature, we ask another important question. What role does literature play in the times of crisis? Take the current crisis as a case in point. Literature will not help find vaccines for COVID, nor people in the field of literature can offer medical or other services to fight the pandemic. Nor can we draft policies to revive the economy devastated during the lockdown. Yet, literature does play and has always played a very crucial role in any point of crisis. Let us look at some of the important elements that connects literature to a crisis. Firstly, literature serves as an important historical testimony of a crisis. Even the staunchest supporters of art for art's sake will agree that literature does reflect the spirit of the times. It captures the essence of the society in which it emerges. Art reflects life in more than one ways and serves as an important document of history, just as how a Shakespearean text becomes a historical document of the Elizabethan period and so on. Secondly, literature goes beyond the official accounts of history. As the famous Latin American writer Carlos Fuentes says, and I quote him, "Literature overtakes history, for literature gives you more than one life. It expands experience and opens new avenues to the readers," unquote. While history records the official data of an event, often giving us a view from the above, literature imagines the personal stories, looking at the crisis from below. That is the perspective of the common man from the margins. The intensely private moments, the emotions, human relationships, and the lives of the people that get affected by disasters are captured by literature. Now, victimhood in disasters is often disproportionate in terms of the socioeconomic standing of the victims, and it is related to poverty, because the poor are not only inadequately equipped to face a disaster, they're also the most potential victims of any hazard, owing to their proximity to the hazardous conditions. Now, literature imagines the devastation of the subaltern during a crisis, an account of which is not likely to be found in the annals of history. Thirdly, and this is a very important point, literature offers the necessary voice of resistance to the injustices that cause and are perpetrated in a disaster. A crisis is often caused by human vices of greed for power or money that jeopardizes the lives of common people. Literature on crisis often exposes the socio-political forces that wreak havoc in the lives of people during a crisis, offering a critical view of the crisis than just a tragedy. Fourthly, literature proposes humanitarian values during a crisis that become essential to survive the crisis. One of the greatest lessons imparted by literature, as the Iranian author Azhar Nafisi points out, is a training in empathy. By assuming different subject positions in a text and by exploring our imagination about the various aspects of the crisis, we can inculcate an essential empathy about the other. And finally, literature offers a philosophical understanding of the crisis, making sense of the confusions and the chaos that reign in the crisis. Most crisis literature are deeply existential, and they ask deeper questions about man, about the universe, man's place in the universe, and offers a larger understanding of the crisis beyond its immediate context. So when we come to think of what literature can offer to us, we can very proudly say that literature plays a very important role at times of crisis, not only by offering deeper insights and documenting the realities of the times, but also by offering a message of hope and larger humanitarian values amidst times of despair. Now let us look at some of the important works of literature, famous works of literature that have been penned on and during global crisis. We have the very famous Albert Camus' The Plague, and we also have Gabriel Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera, both texts addressing the times of crisis, of disasters. We have Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath that document natural disasters. Wilfred Owen's poems on the world wars depict the world wars through a literary point of view, documenting the tragedy, the human tragedy of the wars. We are very familiar with the Holocaust narratives, especially Anne Frank's diary, which takes us to the heart of the tragedy of the Holocaust. The Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombings have been recorded by a very famous book by Masuji Bose, which is called as Black Rain. We have documentation of genocide being represented in texts like Destination Biafra by African authors like Buchi Emecheta. The 9/11 that shook the world, that gave the migrants, especially the migrants in America, such a hard time, and there was this widespread killing and hunting down of the Muslims, have been recorded again by Hamid Mohsin in his book Reluctant Fundamentalist. The virus that we are battling today has already actually been imagined in science fiction texts, several science fiction texts, which imagine a dystopic future for us. And we have an imaginary pandemic being described in books like Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton and Stand by Stephen King. So literature has gone hand in hand with the moments of history, with the moments of real crisis, as well as literature has imagined an impending crisis, something that has not yet happened but might happen. And true to that, literature becomes quite prophetic in terms of understanding how human beings can cope with a crisis in times of disaster. There have been several moments of crisis in Indian history too. And subsequently, several texts of Indian literature have represented humanitarian crisis from different perspectives. In this talk, I'm going to offer a survey of some selected Indian texts that tell the untold stories of the essential human condition during a moment of crisis. We start with a depiction of the Spanish flu. A little bit background about the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu pandemic hit us in 1918, and this was considered to be the deadliest in history at that point of time, which infected an estimated 500 million people worldwide and about 1/3 of the planet's population, which consisted of these 5 million, and it killed an estimated 20 million to 50 million victims. The Spanish flu was first observed in Europe, the United States, and parts of Asia before swiftly spreading around the world. Now, at this time, there were no effective drugs or vaccines to treat this killer flu strain. and citizens were ordered to wear masks, schools, theaters, and businesses were shuttered, and bodies piled up in makeshift morgues before the virus ended its deadly global march. So very similar to the situation that we are going through now with masks and with deaths and with everything closed down. The Spanish flu affected Indians a lot. And in India, the flu had killed an estimated 12 million people. The devastation was so huge that there was nobody to remove the dead bodies, and the jackals made a feast. Now, significantly enough, official records on the Indian devastation on the flu is quite scanty, precisely because the flu did not affect the more privileged British officials and their families as badly. This is very surprising because this is a time under the British Raj, but the worst affected victims of this flu were the common Indians. And we do not find a lot of historical records in the official British records. So given their spacious houses with gardens and yards and an array of household helps to care for them, they were not so badly hit in comparison to the densely populated slums of lower class Indians. And thereby they were largely unconcerned by the chaos sweeping through the country. And this is where literature steps in, because it narrates the untold stories of the forgotten common man during the pandemic. You can see some images from the Spanish flu, which was called as Bombay fever. You can see the array of bodies there lying here, and we can also see how these people were quarantined and they were put in a common facility to treat the flu. So the book that documents this flu in literature is called Twilight in Delhi by Ahmed Ali. Ali's book traces the historical period through 1918 through the personal lives of several characters, portraying a melancholic decline of the Mughal culture and the Muslim society usurped by the British Raj. Among the long historical arc that he draws of the times, he portrays the Spanish flu through personal stories of the characters. Let me read out some passages from the text that depict the utter devastation of the period. So these are quotations from the text, and let me read out some of the things here. He says, Delhi became a city of the dead, but the people of Delhi, true to the traditions of the past, did not miss an opportunity of having a few digs at fortune. They made songs and sang them, and the leaflets containing them were sold for a piece each. How deadly this fever is. Everybody is dying of it. The hospitals are gay and bright, but sorry is men's plight. In another passage, he says, there was not a single hour of the day when the few dead bodies were not carried outside the city to be buried. Soon the graveyards became full, and it was difficult to find even 3 yards of ground to put a person in his final resting place. In life, they had no peace, and even in death, there seemed no hope for rest. He goes on to depict the pandemic, and he says, again I quote, the Hindus were lucky by that way. They went to the bank of the sacred Yamuna, cremated the dead, and threw away the ashes and unburnt bones to the water. Many were thrown away without a shroud of cremation. They were mostly the poor. Yet in death, it was immaterial whether you were naked or clothed or burnt away to be devoured by vultures and jackals. So the whole book is full of such heart-wrenching descriptions of the pandemic, and they reflect the reality of the time that are not to be found in the official history records. Moreover, though the novel portrays how low opportunistic humans can stoop, because he describes that it was a time when some people were making money, like the grave diggers raised their wages and the shout thieves were having a feast on the loot. But overall, the story of the pandemic in this book also shows how human resilience and love survived, and that such moments of crisis are but inevitable turns in the flow of time. So in this book, Ali uses a fluid concept of time, which is very similar to how Quratul Haider uses it in The River of Fire, Aag Ka Darya, and he etches a human tragedy amidst the vast eternity of time. So this book remains a very crucial testimony of the Spanish flu during the time and what happened to the common human beings. during the pandemic. Okay. From the Spanish flu, let us move on to another disaster that has been marked in Indian history, and that is the Bengal famine of 1943. The Bengal famine of 1943 was a famine in the Bengal province of British India. This also happened, as you can see, in the British Raj during World War II. An estimated 2.1 to 3 million out of a population of 60 million died of starvation, malaria, and other diseases aggravated by malnutrition, population displacement, unsanitary conditions, and lack of health care. Millions were impoverished as the crisis overwhelmed large segments of the economy and catastrophically disrupted the social fabric. Eventually, this had a very long-lasting impact because the families disintegrated, men sold their small farms and they left home to look for work and to join the British Army. The women and the children became homeless migrants, often traveling to Calcutta or to the other cities in search of organized relief. Historians have frequently characterized the famine as man-made, asserting that the wartime colonial policies created and then exacerbated the crisis. Let us look at some of the images of the famine, which are extremely haunting and disturbing. I've not put the more haunting ones because they are very disturbing to the sensibilities of the modern readers, but these images are nevertheless extremely disturbing as well. Now, one of the haunting images from the times is that of the long queue of starving humans who have been now reduced to just a bag of bones. And they are mournfully pleading for some rice gruel, or what in Bengali is called as bhater fan, as they died in hordes on the streets. Now, literature does document this, and the text that we are going to talk about is Bhavani Bhattacharya's So Many Hungers. This text poignantly captures the horrors of the crisis. What is interesting about this novel is that this novel also holds and gives us a very clear thesis that the condition was a man-made problem in which 2 million men, women, and children died because of black marketeers who hoarded bags of grain to cash in upon them later. Several horrors of the famine are portrayed through the protagonist, whose name is Rahul, and Rahul's critical observation of black marketeering through the plight of the female protagonist and through the plight of the female protagonist, whose name is Kajoli, who gets raped and almost trafficked. In a scene describing the starving man, Rahul wonders, and I quote here, "Strange how much a human body could go through before life left at last. The first few days, the man suffered most. He was mad with hunger, then he grew listless. He laid himself down, his mouth was too tired for food, and he only wanted to be left alone. His eyes died. He wasted to a skeleton, using up whatever shreds of flesh he had anywhere on his body." So there are several other graphic descriptions of the violence meted out on fellow human beings, especially the starving and the poor, during this famine. And yet, the final note on this book is of new hope and resilience of the human spirit amidst the darkest crisis. The book ends with numerous moments of human values and empathy. For example, Kajoli's rapist finally repents. Kajoli's brother shows extraordinary courage. Kajoli finds a way of leading a respectable life and starts things anew. Rahul, who has witnessed the spectacle of the endless miseries of the famished, uprooted millions, reaches thronged with people beaming with exultation. And finally, in the book, the author affirms, and this is the final message that is given in the book, there was no defeat in the voices, but a secret, excited triumph. Listening, Rahul began to lose his sadness, for in that instant he saw past the clouds of pain. He saw the horizon of the last illumined by new dawn. With an unswerving conviction in the brightness of life, the novelist illustrates his conception of high life, which is without hate, without anger, in a nirvana of passionlessness. So this is another book that captures the moment of crisis, but ultimately gives a very strong message of rejuvenation, of new hope, of new dawns coming after the crisis is over. Next, we move on to something that we all know about, and that is partition. Across the Indian subcontinent, communities that had coexisted for almost a millennium attacked each other in a terrifying outbreak of sectarian violence, with Hindus and Sikhs on one side and Muslims on the other side, a mutual genocide as unexpected as it was unprecedented. In Punjab and Bengal, provinces abutting India's borders with West and East Pakistan respectively, the carnage was especially intense, with massacres, arson, forced conversions, mass abductions, and savage sexual violence. Some 75,000 women were raped, and many of them were then disfigured and dismembered. As we all know, several people were displaced, homes were lost, and families were separated. A very haunting image from the times of partition is those of the trains. And you can see how people were loading themselves in the trains, moving across borders. This is a photograph from the history, and you can see the tragedy being etched out in the photo. Now, partition is one incident, is one event which has been documented very prolifically in literature. So the thing is, while the history of partition record the number of victims, partition's intense trauma is brought out in its testimonies, eyewitness accounts, and literature of the times. Partition has been one of the most prolific disasters in terms of its literary output. We have numerous literary works, like the short stories of Saadat Hasan Manto or Bhisham Sahani's Tamas, or Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, Rahim Azam Riza's A Village Divided, and several others in regional languages as well. A book that stands out amidst this intensely tragic text is the book that I'm going to talk about today, and that is Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan. The novel is set in a fictional village called Manu Majra, and the novel depicts how the common villagers and their lives are irreversibly altered by the chaos of partition. Train to Pakistan has its share of graphic violence. There is a detailed passage in the book that describes the inhuman slaughter that happens in the trains taking people across the borders. Spine-chilling accounts of trains full of corpses or mutilated bodies abound in the text. I'm going to read out only one passage. It says, and I quote, "The northern horizon, which had turned a bluish grey, showed orange again. The orange turned into copper and then into a luminous russet. Red tongues of flame leaped into the black sky. A soft breeze began to blow toward the village. It brought the smell of burning kerosene, then wood, and then a faint acrid smell of searing flesh. The village was stilled in a deathly silence. No one asked anyone else what the odor was. They all knew. They had known it all the time. The answer was implicit in the fact that the train had come from Pakistan and it carried human bodies, dead bodies, burnt alive." So these are passages that are there in the book, extremely disturbing to read. But interestingly, what remains with the readers after we complete the book is not the violence, but the ultimate sacrifice of Jagat Singh, the character that is there in the book. When the villagers planned to derail the train carrying Muslim passengers to Pakistan, including Jagat Singh's Muslim beloved Nooran, Singh saves the train by sacrificing his own life. The train goes unscathed over his body and goes to Pakistan, and the story ends with a triumph of love over hate, humanity over bestiality. Now, there have been several other humanitarian crises in post-independence India: the Sikh genocide, the Bangladesh Liberation War, Hindu-Muslim riots, emergency, the list can go on. Among them, one event stands out in its prolonged impact on the current generation of victims: the tragedy of the Bhopal gas disaster. So a little bit of, again, background on the Bhopal gas disaster. Bhopal gas tragedy on a December night in 1984 was caused by the Union Carbide India Limited. This was a pesticide plant in Bhopal, and in the dead of the night, this plant leaked around 27 tons of poisonous methyl isocyanide gas This is the time when the people were sleeping. They had no idea what was happening, and they smelled, they inhaled the gas in their sleep, and it killed and injured thousands of people with fatal health consequences. Since then, it is interesting to note that the disaster happened in 1984, but the effects are felt even today, even in 2020. Since then, the disaster has claimed around 15,000 lives, injured around 6 lakhs, and continues to wreak havoc in the subsequent generations of victims. There are accounts of subsequent generations, babies born with birth deformity because of the effect that gas had on the previous generation. So babies are born with deformities, with lifelong problems, respiratory issues, and the struggle against this disaster continues even now. Simultaneously, since Union Carbide was a part of the US-based multinational company, the UCC, that is the Union Carbide Corporation, the tragedy also exemplifies the worst case of corporate irresponsibility, state ineptitude, and minimal retribution for the affected, making it one of the longest running protest movements in India against the government and the corporation. The victims are still waiting for their compensation. There have been several lawsuits which have not led to anything. And the CEO, the then CEO, has now fled to the US, and now he is long dead. And there is no hope for the victims. And they are keeping on, they're going on fighting against this case. These are some haunting images from the disaster, as you can see. Extremely disturbing. The image on the left has become like the poster of the violence of the disaster, the child being buried in the ground. And then you have mass graves, as always, being laid out whenever there is a massive disaster that strikes. So this was the reality of the disaster, and the reality continues. How does literature address this? I'm going to talk about a text titled as Animals People, written by Indra Sinha. Indra Sinha's Animals People narrates the story of the ordinary people forever scarred by a fictional industrial disaster, which closely replicates the Bhopal gas tragedy. Abandoned by the multinational company from where the disastrous gas had leaked and neglected by the government, the affected people living on the fringes battle against poverty, sickness, death, and a bleak denial of basic human rights. Animals People narrates the disaster through personal stories. The victims here are not just numbers, but individuals with legacies of personal loss, testifying the vulnerability of the poorest margins in an environmental disaster. The main protagonist is Animal, and he has been orphaned, and his spine has been incurably twisted that makes him walk on all fours. He is somewhere like a hybrid between an animal and a human, because he is no longer recognizable as a human being. He walks like an animal, and he looks like an animal. Almost all the residents of Khaufpur, that is the fictional town that we find in the book, which is very, very close to actual Bhopal, and it has been affected by the gas disaster in some way or the other. Thousands died and left innumerable families affected. There are victims that are named in the story, like Pyare Bai, who lost her husband. There is a character called Pandit Somraj, who lost his family and his voice. There is another character called Huria Bi, who lost her daughter and is left with a distorted, maimed granddaughter. Animal becomes a subversive figure in not only occupying a hybrid identity between a human and an animal, he also lashes out at the journalists who showcase disasters as a spectacle. This is a very interesting element in the book, that it kind of lashes out at people that try to look at a disaster as a spectacle, as something to see from a distance, but not really becoming part of it. So Animal says, he lashes out at the journalist, and he says, and I quote, "Many books have been written about this place. Not one has changed anything for the better. How will yours be different? You will bleed like all the rest. You will talk of rights, law, justice, Those words sound the same in my mouth as in yours, but they don't mean the same. So this is how animal resists any attempt of commercializing the disaster or letting the TV channels or the journalists come and make a show of the disaster without really siding with the victims. Now, through these stories and through animals' caustic jibe at the media who make a living out of other people's disasters, animals people, as Sheila Jasana points out, and I quote, in recent years, a work of fiction, Indra Sinha's novel Animals People, may have done more to revive international interest in Bhopal and thus to touch the conscience of the world than decades of medical or legal action. So this is the power of literature that Jasmine talks about, that an imaginary place based on Bhopal, an imaginary story, has stirred people so much that there has been a renewed interest in an incident that happened so many decades ago. So this is the power of literature in depicting a disaster, because it is not only about telling a story, it is about also evoking the right amount of affect in terms of the readers. So what stands out in the book for me, apart from the harrowing experiences of the victims of the disaster, is the discourse of collective action. There is a character called Zafar, and Zafar's character is etched as a revolutionary leader victim who organizes collective actions for the victims. Yet it is animals' personal act of resistance at the microcosmic level that gives the novel its much desired notion of hope. So at the end of the story, Animal is offered an opportunity of going to America and getting his fine operated on. However, Animal chooses to give up his personal gain to stay back with his group in collective solidarity. And thereby, he completely rejects the classic neoliberal trope of self-care, that we must only look for ourselves and that we must take care of only ourselves. Rather, Animal's final words of defiance are no less than a revolutionary manifesto, suggesting the immutability of the common people on the margins. And this is how the book ends. These are very powerful words with which the book ends. It says, "Remember me, all things pass, but the poor remain. We are the people of Apocalypse," which is apocalypse. He is mispronouncing it because he is, just a person from the margins. But he says, "We are the people of Apocalypse. Tomorrow, there will be more of us." Thus, in spite of all its sarcasm, Animals People is a story of the indomitable spirit of the common man in the face of adversity, and a pain to collective resistance in a neoliberal world that is built on dominant narratives of self-care and individual interest. And finally, we come to the literature of our times. That is the literature that has been penned down during COVID-19, the greatest global humanitarian crisis after the world wars. Our shared existence and the transnational networks in a post-globalized world have aggravated the crisis that can no longer be contained within national or geographical boundaries. However, while the pandemic has affected all, it is the lowest margins who, like always, bear the maximum brunt of any disaster. The issue of socioeconomic marginalization of the victims is crucial in understanding the complete power dynamics of the post-disaster scenario. So, as I already said, that victimhood in any kind of disaster is often disproportionate in terms of its socioeconomic standing of the victims and whoever is related to poverty, because the poor are inadequately equipped to face a disaster. And we are seeing the same thing here as well. We see it in the differential privilege of the upper and middle classes who can stay at home and urge each other to learn new hobbies and new films. We can afford to do that. We have the privilege. But in comparison to our privilege, we have the poorer margins, the migrant workers who are walking miles amidst the lockdown, often getting perished in the process. Now, literature of the times also captures the duality of the crisis. And literature makes sure that we do not forget those on the margins and what they went through. I am going to read a little bit from Gulzar's poem on the migrant workers. This poem has been penned in Hindi originally, but I've got an English translation. I'm going to read some of it from the English translation. This is how it goes. The pandemic raged, the workers and laborers fled to their homes. All the machines ground to a halt in the cities. Only their hands and feet moved, their lives they had planted back in the village. So this is an act of homecoming for the migrants. But this act of homecoming is not a romanticized return of the native to his place of origin. Rather, Gulzar shows the troubles that plagued the migrant back home and the very factors that led them move away from home. So he says, those fights at the canals and waterways, the strong men hired sometimes from their side and sometimes from this, the lawsuits dating back to grandparents and granduncles, engagements, marriages, fields, drought, flood, the fear, will the skies rain or not? They will go die there, where there is life. So this is the reality that they're going back to. Yes, they're leaving their place of work, but what are they going back to? There is not really a lot of choice for them. And yet, they have only brought their bodies and plugged them in. They pulled out the plugs. Come, let's go home. They set off. They will go to die there where there is life. Look at the last line and the poignant tragedy that is encapsulated in the last line. The migrant laborer is almost caught between the devil and the deep sea. He's coming away from death to his home, but only to die. Literature of the pandemic has often harped on the intense human tragedy, especially of the lives, the precarious lives on the margins. And Gulzar's poem captures the impassioned tone of an inescapable tragedy, that no matter where they go, they are to die. And finally, we move on to something hopeful. And let us end our session with a poem by Priya Sarukhai Chabria. And this is how she writes the poem. This is again not the whole poem, but the one that I have on my right. These are excerpts from her poem. Title of the poem is Bank. And she says, child, will the rivers run not with poison, but deep and blue for you? Swift with dolphins, splashed with hope, will bees hum amber hymns of swollen pollen to you who stands on the other bank? Past the disharmony of word, spirit, which swarms this bank from which I peer, will parrots sing the sky together in emerald strands while we turn to sleep. So she begins her poem with a dream of a pure, pristine world. And this world that she brings to us is almost an ethereal world. It is etched with almost ethereal strokes of natural beauty. The dolphins are splashing. There are amber hymns being sung by the bees. There are parrots that are singing in the sky together in emerald strands. So this is the beautiful world that she imagines leaving for her child. The child is the next generation that is going to come. And she also reflects on the current crisis. And she says that the world has come to a standstill. And we stand bare-armed, rooted in insecurities. And yet she ends with a note of hope. She says that, but this I say to you with no inconsistency. It's never too late to vision yourself and the world anew. That's what we are trying to do as it breaks on us. That we are standing muddy-toed at the tirth all alone. So she calls this crisis, this point, as a tirth. Tirth here is obviously the Hindi or the Sanskrit term tirtha, which means a pilgrimage. So it is almost as sacred as a pilgrimage. And we have to start things anew, right? So with this, I think we can hope for a better future. Let us also hope to restart our world with a new vision and with a deeper empathy for our fellow beings, with lesser greed and a more meaningful life. Let us hope that the virus has brought to us a deeper realization of ourselves, and we have a better understanding of the world around us. So with this, I stop my session and let us have a discussion with everybody so that we can also get inputs from you. And if you have any questions, you can ask me.
Thank you, Dr. Swarlipi. I am actually swept off my feet. It has hit me once again below the belt. The session was so soul twisting. You presented a very heart-touching narration of the crisis. The harrowing experience of animal brings forth the strongest message that it is not all about us. The indomitable spirit of man, the difference between the privileged and the unprivileged, and how the suffering majority has little hope, how crisis has made people stand rooted in insecurity. Still, we need to start a life with a new vision, which encompasses a lot of empathy towards others. And if we still don't learn a lesson through this, then we have lost out on our very soul. We have lost out on, with all the education that man has achieved, he has still lost out on being a sympathetic human. And if we lose out on this, we have actually lost out on a major existence, identity of mankind. Thank you so much. I'm sure the participants are enthralled. They have enjoyed your lecture. Many of them are asking your PPT to be shared with everyone, which I'm sure you would love to. And I know how literature has stored. In fact, the best of literature comes out from these crises. Anyway, it is. I would move ahead now and bring forth the question and answer session. And I hope the participants have questions to ask. And do put in your questions in the chat box, please.
Thank you so much for your comments, ma'am. I enjoyed the session as much as you did, and it really stirs me as a person related to literature that we are doing something very important. It's not that, a lot of people ask us, okay, you are not going out and you are not finding a cure for COVID, or you are not really involved in finding a solution for the pandemic. That doesn't mean that we are not doing crucial work. This is important. A documentation of humanity is important. And many things that are missed by official records are recorded by literature. It creates a sense of empathy. It creates a sense of understanding, which is very, very important for us to proceed in a post-COVID world.
Yeah, I read it in passing somewhere, Dr. Swarlipi, that when God's greatest creation is born with a deformity, then where should he look for perfection? And the answer is, he looks for perfection in the response of the people towards it. So what is the response of the people today? Are they just passing it off and saving themselves, or are they standing up and moving ahead? There are some wonderful questions that have come up. Manisha Chautra is saying, it was a treat listening to you. So that was very good. Then Vijayarani saying, what is the reason for literary response to calamitize and disasters being sparse compared to creative, prolific literature?
Could you please repeat the question once again?
It is something like, what is the reason for literary response to calamitize and disasters being sparse compared to creative, prolific literature? I said, I think what the person is trying to say is that why is the presentation of so heart-wrenching and gory in literature, and why not more creative and prolific?
Right. There has been two kinds of responses to any kind of crisis. I mean, there is obviously a response which is based on art for art's sake, where we create something beautiful. We create something that is creative in literature, which does not necessarily relate to the social realities. But as a literary text, there are certain responsibilities of the writer to bring to the fore untold stories, to bring to the fore realities that might not be recorded anywhere. And that is where literature wins over history. Literature wins over many official documents. If you follow the partition literature, for example, if you'll see that the personal testimonies of the people, the eyewitness accounts, the actual experiences that people went through are not there in history. You will not find any history book which talks about what personal loss people had when their families were torn apart, when they were thrown across the borders, when their women were raped openly. So these are things that are recorded by literature because we are trying to find the gaps that are not there. Imagine we are reading partition literature, we are going through the horrors of partition literature through literature. If we go back to history, it will not give us the extent, the magnitude of the horrors that has come through. So many of these writers feel responsible towards the times, towards the society, towards the people, because writers are very powerful. They are extremely powerful spokesperson of the society. And many writers feel that it is not enough to just create a beautiful verse or create a beautiful literary device and put it in the text. It is also important to be the voice, and especially the voice of the margins, because who are going to speak to them? The migrant worker is not going to sit down and pen a poem. He's not going to sit down. He doesn't have time for that. He is traveling for survival. He's dying on the way. So the onus is on literary writers to speak for the ones who have not spoken, who are unable to speak, and extend our imagination. Because what literature does, and there is a brilliant book, I mentioned the book in my talk as well, but I would urge every passionate reader of literature to read this book. It is called Reading Lolita in Tehran by Azza Nafisi. And there she talks about the essential qualities that literature tries to inculcate in humans. It is not only just reading for the sake of passing some time. It is also a training in human empathy. It is also a training in understanding the other, in becoming a better human being. So literature plays a very important role in inculcating these values. And that is why a lot of literature feel bound and feel responsible to respond to the things are not being said very openly.
Absolutely. As Sir Philip Sidney says, literature motivates a man to higher action.
Absolutely.
And not only recording of the facts. There is another question, Dr. Swarlipi. It is from Geeta Sri Mukherjee. She says, Madam, do you think in a time when freedom of speech is curbed, the writers today still have a space to call a spade fearlessly without being caught in any political or other interventions?
This is a very interesting question, and I would love to respond to it. My answer to this is literature does have a lot of ways in which we can say things without being caught. And this is the beauty of literature, because you can always say that this is an imaginary story. This is a difference between journalists and literary writers, because literature offers you a lot of literary techniques. There are techniques of science fiction, there are techniques of satire, there are techniques of irony that one can incorporate in a literary text, and yet not claim that we are representing the actual life person. So that is the power of literature. I just want to point out a couple of texts. For example, as you know, that during emergency, everything was censored. There was censorship on print media. There was censorship on on TV and other things. And yet, if you look at the amount of literary output that we have during emergency, where there has been an open criticism of the people who perpetrated the emergency, and yet they're literary texts, and nobody can jail them for writing a story, right? So you have, the saga of Dharmapuri, or you have the great Indian novel. If you read as a reader, you chuckle, because you know what they're talking about. Because the literary devices are used in a way where you are talking about society. but then nobody has ever been jailed, barring from a few cases. Obviously, I mean, we can mention Salman Rushdie's fatwa that has been put on him for satanic verses, where certain texts of literature are banned in certain places. Obviously, they are there. But officially, it is very difficult to jail somebody or to file a case against somebody for a literary work. And that is where we have a lot of freedom. We are almost like court jesters in the earlier days. The court jesters could say things on the face of the king because they were court jesters. And nobody would penalize them for saying things because they would say in jest. So literature has a lot of avenues of doing that without directly hitting at people where they might be in trouble.
There are other questions coming up, Dr. Swarlipi, which are quite similar in nature. Now, Prabjot Kaur has asked, literature should be the true representation of voice and problems. Do you think that sometimes external elements dominates this aspect of literature? Of course, it is something very similar to what you have just answered. And then we have another question from Bhanumati Vijayakrishnan, who has asked a specific question, saying that, could you please give us some information about the book Bend in the Ganges, which portrays deftly the partition?
Okay, I'll take up these two questions one by one. Number one is obviously in terms of external factors. Modern day publishing is not only an action of just going and writing a book. There are a lot of things involved, and especially with the commercialization of the publication industry, there are a lot of factors. They are just like any other product which needs to be seen whether they can be marketable. There are agents handling publications and authors and how they will be marketed. We all know about the marketing of the Harry Potter books, how there is a build-up in terms of suspense, and then a book is released at midnight. So these factors are obviously there. These are external factors. All writers would want to be successful. All writers would want to be marketable. No writer would want to not sell his or her book. So if we talk about external factors, yes, it is not only about what the writer wants to write, but there are several other external factors that govern the writing and the publication of those writings. We cannot deny that. But having said that, I strongly believe that the writers, and most of the writers, or all of the writers, if we can say that, they do have an innate creative spirit within them that will help them tower over these external factors. And eventually the writer is writing because he or she wants to tell the story. So no matter whatever is the external factor or whatever is the market demand, or however, how commercialized the publication industry is going, writer will write a story that the writer feels right writing. And many times they are not even, they don't even care about the repercussions of that. So somewhere, there is a kind of a bridge between the creative elements of the writer and the market demands and other factors, including publication of a text. Coming to the second question, Bend in the Ganges, as I mentioned, that not only Bend in the Ganges, there are many other books that talk about the partition in different ways. What is interesting about partition literature is that, and if anybody is interested in partition literature, I would urge you to look up the partition literature from Pakistan as well. It's a brilliant way to compare the Indian perspective of partition and the Pakistani perspective of partition. And it is very interesting to see how there are overlaps and how there are differences in terms of understanding what happened during the partition. So Bend in the Ganges obviously is there, but then there are many others as well where you can look up. Partition has been one of the most prolific literary periods, and we have plenty, and we have texts from regional literatures also. So there are plenty of texts which can be taken up for comparative analysis, and it would be partition studies is actually one of the most prolific literary fields as well to do research on. So there are many things that one can do.
and very close to the soul, since it sings of the very painful periods and experiences. There's a very interesting question coming up, Dr. Swarlipi, from Prabjot Kaur. She says, when it comes to Dalit literature, only a Dalit can actually speak of the true oppression they face. What if they never had a chance and the sufferings remained unnoticed, unrecognized?
Right. I mean, this is a classic debate that we have in the field of subaltern studies and any kind of marginal literature. Who should be writing the literature? Is it the onus? Is the onus only on marginal writers? Or can anybody take up? Now, this debate has not been resolved. Different people have different positions in terms of that. So there are several, the one side of the debate would say that in terms of authentic representation, it is only the Dalit or the Aboriginal or the Santal or the tribal or, anybody who is on the margins. They should be the authentic voices. But the other side of the debate says, as you rightly point out, what if they do not have recourse to writing? What if they do not have the privilege? Because writing and getting published is also a privilege. We cannot deny that. Not everybody has the privilege to sit down and write and then take the writing somewhere and then get it published. So this is a classic debate. If you're asking me about my personal opinion, I do not believe that marginal writing should come only from the marginal community because it doesn't make sense. And if we recall the famous essay by Gayatri Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? And Spivak says the subaltern cannot speak. The moment the subaltern speaks, the subaltern becomes a privileged subaltern. So there will always be a grading in terms of who is more privileged and lesser privileged among the marginal communities as well. Because when we talk about the term Dalit also, not all Dalits are equally deprived and not all Dalits are equally privileged. So we have a gradation there as well. So how far are we going to go down the ladder? Are we going to go down the ladder to the point where we reach the most deprived subaltern? In that case, who's going to speak for their voices? So I completely agree with you. This debate, personally to me, is useless because an act of literature is not an act of biography. You don't need to always talk about yourself. You can imagine a character, you can imagine a subject. And that is where the element of literary imagination comes in, where we can move out of our personal identities and assume an identity and imagine a world for that identity.
There are more questions coming up, Dr. Swarlipi. And there is one Mrs. Shireen Begum who's asking, ma'am, do you think literature and documentation of humanitarian crisis in the earlier times helped the present crisis to be tackled? So far, this literature have dominated and helped the technology today. Of course, it has not helped the technology. Yes, technology has been a medium to bring it more closer for man to realize and understand it. But then her question basically is, ma'am, do you think literature and documentation of humanitarian crisis in the earlier times helped the present crisis to be tackled?
The question is similar to how we approach history as well. We many times say that we learn from history, but do we really learn? So the documentation is important, just like how history documents, literature also documents. But what we make of it is something that is very subjective and something that depends on what we do with it. For example, as I mentioned, the Spanish flu and its depiction in Twilight in Delhi. If you read the book, the passages that are there are so similar to what is happening now. It's astounding. But the thing is, are we really doing anything in terms of learning from history or learning from literature? If we are learning from history and literature, if literature provokes us to think about the world differently, then when this lockdown ends and the world gets back to normal, we will try to live a different life. How many of us are going to do that? Is it this end of our life, which is full of consumption, which is full of self-care? Are we going to change things for ourselves? So literature will do its work, but then how we want to take it and what we want to do with it is completely subjective.
The world has always bounced back from various crises. It has taken time. It depends upon the length of the crisis. So is the response of the people. But the world does bounce back. Himanshi Kashyap is asking, how would be the post COVID-19 literature like?
Post COVID-19 literature, we have to wait to see. The literature that is coming up now can be seen in two kinds of ways. One is, as I that's why I gave you two examples. One is talking about the problems of the crisis. It's talking about the intense pain, the death, the tragedy of the crisis. But on the other hand, there is also literature that talks about hope, that talks about rejuvenation, that talks about something positive that is coming out. So post-COVID literature will definitely reflect on what we are going through, but then the tone of that reflection might vary according to what the writer wants to take away from this crisis. What are we going to take away from this crisis? Are we going to see this period when this is all over, when we get back to what we call as the quote-unquote normal? Now, the question remains whether our normal is correctly normal. That is a different question. But when we get back to our normal life, what are we going to retain of this time? Are we going to look back and learn some lessons from here? Or are we going to carry on with whatever we are doing? So that is again something that we have to wait and see. In terms of COVID literature, we can see two very specific strains in terms of offering hope as well as reflecting on the tragedy of the pandemic.
Absolutely. It is going to be pandemic writing, dystopian novels, and something like that. There is an avalanche of questions, Swarlipi. So I will just take a few more. I mean, just 2 or 3 more, and then we will reach to a logical end, of course, because it is more motivating, emotional, and responsive. We need to respond to it in some way or the other.
Absolutely.
And if the faster we do it, the better. So again, Mrs. Prabjot Kaur is asking, the Hungry Tide representing Moranjappi massacre.
Moranjappi, yeah.
Moranjappi massacre. What should such crisis be called, as imposed crisis or natural crisis? Imposed on people who have no platform to represent their voices.
Right. Again, a very interesting question. This is again the power of literature. A lot of readers did not know about Moranjappi till they read Hungry Tide. This is what literature does. It brings out things that history tries to hide. It brings out things that people in power would want you to not look at. So the Moranjappi massacre was not very well publicized when it happened. And if you go back and look at the historical records, the press prints and other things, you will find very scanty material. This massacre, again, is a very complex massacre because it brings us to the classic debate between animals versus humans, the biocentric worldview and the anthropocentric worldview. Because if we, for people who might not know what the Moranjappi massacre is, let me just, briefly talk about it. So there was this bunch of refugees who had come and settled on one of the Sundarban islands that was reserved for the tigers. It was part of the tiger reservation project. So the government, the then West Bengal government, tried to evict them, and obviously these people are homeless people, completely migrant, completely, refugee. They don't have anywhere else to go. They refused to leave. And when they refused to leave, they were forcefully evicted. And in the process of eviction, many lost their lives and many lost their homes. And it was a tragedy. Now, to look at it as a tragedy is something that wants us to look at also the human factors that were part of it. Obviously, the callousness of the government in solving this, the kind of forceful eviction that happened during this is something that we definitely want to condemn, and that is what the book also condemns. What is interesting for me as a student, as a scholar of literature, is that this incident is completely hidden. It is kind of, completely made oblivious in the public mind for a long, long time till Amitabh Ghosh's Hungry Tide comes out, and everybody started searching about Moranjappi again and again and again, and it goes beyond the boundaries of Bengal, and it goes to international readership. So this is something that literature does. It talks about things that are wrong. It talks about injustices. it talks about human-led disasters, just like the Bengal famine. Morijapi also was a human-led disaster. But it cannot be seen through a lens of a simple disaster because there are complex questions involved in terms of what should be our approach to the human-animal conflict. Recently, we had a case with the Kerala elephant, and there were different camps regarding that. But things are not that simple. We need to look at it in a complex matter. What happens to people who are co-living with these animals? Should the animals be protected or should the people be protected? So these are questions that we need to ask.
And a very interesting question again by Venkat Reddy. Is there any literary piece blaming the human race that the crisis is the result of man meddling with nature? Of course, I believe what you've just given the answer also suits good for this. And then this gentleman, he had also put up a question yesterday, which I was not able to take it. So I would like to you to respond to him. Mr. Gulzar Ahmad. Ma'am, you talked about partition literature. Is conflicted literature always rich?
Rich in the sense the content.
The content, yeah. Conflict literature that addresses the manifold aspects of a conflict will always offer us a lot of ways to look at it. What partition literature does is not only look at the realities of partition, they try to interpret the partition for us. And that is what it becomes very rich for us. That it's a very rich reading experience for us. Because we are not only reading journalistic accounts, we are also trying to get into the perspectives, the point of views of the subjects, and trying to see, what was happening, what was the dehumanization. We see that people behave like a bunch of madmen during the partition. What was actually happening? Are the people to be blamed, or there was something else? Are the times to be blamed? So partition literature offers multiple perspectives in understanding partition, not only a journalistic account of the partition. And in that sense, I definitely believe that partition literature is very rich, especially in showcasing the position of the women and the tragedy that befell the women. It's a very, very rich repository of the women's experience of partition that, again, is not to be found in any official record. That was wonderful, Swarlipi. I believe most of the questions are around the same nature, and they are talking about literature per se as referred to the crisis, whether man-made or human. Will literature be strong enough as a tool? Yes, of course it is. There is one more question, probably the last one, which has come up. Aren't women better equipped to deal with this crisis? As for most of them, the world was always partially shut down and always had to take safety measures, even at the domestic front. I believe, I don't know how to respond to it.
Well, if you are asking for my opinion, I don't think so, because I think if you again look at the records, especially from National Women's Commission, you will see that domestic violence cases have gone up by leaps and bounds. So the women are not necessarily better equipped. Yes, culturally we seem to have a kind of a training to deal with crisis, and we seem to have a training in taking responsibility more than men. But the pandemic has affected women in several other ways. And when we look at the figures of domestic violence, whether abusive husbands or the male members are staying 24/7 with them, abusing them, taking out the frustration on the wives and the daughters and so on, we don't think that they are better equipped per se. So I would not agree with the idea, but in terms of cultural training, in terms of how we expect women to be, the caregivers, and we expect women to look after the others, and they are the primary, household responsibilities are primarily on them. That is culturally a part of our training, and that way we are better equipped in terms of handling the pandemic, but not really in terms of how they're faring. They're not faring very well.
Yeah. By and large, Dr. Swarlipi, it is on the same parameters.
Anjali ma'am,
Sure, ma'am.
can I ask ma'am one question?
Sure.
Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. Go ahead.
Yes. Dr. Swarlipi Nandi, as you are the head department of English and Psychology and Journalism, I would like to ask a question which is related to psychology. How to address the psychological
Ma'am
aspects
is-
of the
ma'am-
challenge?
Ma'am is doctor in English teacher. Her department is English, Psychology and Journalism.
Okay. Okay. So one.
Yes, ma'am, you can still ask, probably.
Yeah. How to
Yeah, sure.
address the psychological aspects of the challenges which the men and the women and the children are undergoing during the time of the pandemic and after the COVID? What is your suggestion? How to how to overcome these challenges, psychological?
Right. We did have a webinar exactly on this topic, and as ma'am rightly pointed out, that we have a triple major department. That means all three disciplines are offered. I do not specialize in psychology, though I head the department as an administrative head for the department. But these are three different courses that are offered by faculty members of three different streams. What came out during our webinar when trained psychologists were speaking, counselors and different motivational speakers and so on, they were all talking about two things. Number one, taking things one at a time. Do not make future plans. If you make future plans and they are not getting met, then there is a sort of a frustration that builds up. Because mentally you have thought, okay, my, this flight is going to end on June 30th. 1st July, I'm going to do this. So they're saying, don't do that. Take one day at a time and congratulate yourself that you have successfully survived this day and move on to the next. So that is the approach that they were promoting. And secondly, they asked us to take, credit for just staying alive or just staying safe. So do not set again huge deadlines, or do not be too ambitious. That okay, fine. A lot of us are under pressure to create and to produce things, as we all know. Okay, write 2 papers, attend 5 webinars, do this, do that. But what they are advocating is that you don't need to do that. You have survived. You are happy. You are alive. You are safe. That should be your primary concern. Once you are done with this, then you focus on productivity. So they all of them, we had 3 speakers and everybody harped on the same thing, that do not set yourself for productivity. Do not set ambitious goals of productivity. Just be there. Just, make it through it. And then later on, we'll see what to do in terms of productivity.
Yeah, it is a time. This is the time of crisis. So setting goals in crisis, the only goal is that we should just go through it, sail through it. Each one of us. That is very important. And Dr. Swarlipi, I will stop here in the sense that we won't barge you with more questions. There is an avalanche of it.
You can always mail me the questions, and if anybody wants to, have any interaction with me later on, I'm happy to share my email ID. We can carry this forward.
There are participants who were asking for your
Sure,
contact
definitely.
number and mail ID.
Sure, I would be happy to share. No problem.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swarlipi. And I take, we are towards the end of our webinar. I once again want to inform you about the video submissions made by the participants. Thank you so much for contributing your videos. I have been going through all of them, and some of them are really good. So we can see that the understanding of the subject, the expressions are put forth very clearly by many of you. That was very motivating. So we will share the slide which bears the link of the videos sent by the participants. Mawani ma'am, I will request you to put the slide if you have it. Yes, this is the slide for today. Yesterday we had sent you one slide. These are the links. You can click these links and view the videos. I will also be posting it in the group so that it is open to all the participants. And the link will be shared on the webinar WhatsApp group. So this is the set of the remaining videos. And with this, we come to the conclusion to the end of the seminar. And thank you so much for being there. I hope you have enjoyed it. And I would like to thank Dr. Swarlipi for once again for her thought-invoking views and responses to the queries of the participants, and the PG Department of English, also the students and the teachers who have been tirelessly working in the backdrop, compiling and merging things. And I mean, the students have been doing just a wonderful job. They have been holding the fort at the back. And of course, I would like to thank the ITC cell of the college who have assisted us in airing this and going live stream on video, making it easy for us and easy for the participants to be a part of it. It has been a great pleasure to know many of you and interact with most of you personally. I hope you enjoyed both the sessions. Please comment in the chat box how your experience has been. We will be sharing the link of the YouTube of both the sessions with you in the webinar group. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Swarlipi, once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure for me too. I enjoyed the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, participants. You can be offline if you wish to. Yes, I've just got a question from one of our student assistants. Ma'am, participants are asking for Swarlipi ma'am's mail ID. I will share it in the group. I will have to take it out and then post it. I will share it in the group. So that everybody has access to it. Thank you. Over to Mangwani ma'am. Mangwani ma'am, can I hand it over to you?
Ma'am, still we are on live. The students are filling the feedback. We will be
Okay.
maintaining this session for a few more minutes like this.
Okay. Okay, ma'am. So can we can we just post the web our brochure once again? The second page.
Ma'am, do you want the brochure to be posted or the video link to be posted?
Video link, ma'am, I will post in the webinar group. We have already showed, and now if we can have the second page of the brochure. Ma'am, second slide. Yes, ma'am. I will request all the participants to please fill in the feedback form on YouTube, because today's feedback form will not be there on the webinar group, because we need to maintain, collect the data of your attendance. Mangwani ma'am.
Still there are 15. Still 15 members are there, ma'am, on the group. Still they're filling the form.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Not an issue.
Yes, I'm going to stop the live stream.
Yes.
Yeah, we are